The December wind cut through Bledsoe County Cemetery like God's own blade, carrying with it the scent of mesquite and the promise of another brutal Texas winter. Cullen Tate knelt in the frozen earth beside his wife's grave, his knees numb against the hard ground, fingers wrapped around a small glass vial that caught the pale moonlight like a shard of broken hope. The headstone bore simple words carved deep into weathered granite: Sarah Elizabeth Tate, beloved wife and mother, 1842, 1874. 8 months she'd been in the ground. 8 months of waking to empty sheets and cold coffee, of watching his children fade like flowers in drought, of drowning himself in whiskey that never quite killed the pain gnawing at his chest. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah." He whispered, his breath forming ghostly clouds in the bitter air. His voice cracked like dry leather. "The children, they need their mama. They need someone who ain't broken." The vial contained oleander extract enough to stop a man's heart in minutes. He'd prepared it that morning after watching 6-year-old Clara cry herself to sleep again, after seeing 8-year-old Eddie trying to mend a fence with hands too small for the work. Better to join Sarah than to fail them both as father and provider. His thumb worked at the cork memories flooding back unbidden. Sarah's laugh echoing through their adobe ranch house. The way she'd hum while kneading bread flour, dusting her dark hair. How she'd looked at him on their wedding day, like he was her whole world made manifest. All of it gone now, buried beneath 6 feet of Texas clay and his own failures. The cork came free with a soft pop. "Just a swallow," he murmured to the headstone. "Then I'll be with you, darling. Then this hurt will finally stop." He raised the vial toward his chapped lips, tasting the bitter wind and his own desperation. In his mind, he could already see her, Sarah, waiting for him. Beyond that dark threshold, arms, open forgiveness in her eyes. "Papa." The cry pierced the night like a rifle shot. Cullen's head snapped toward the cemetery gate, where Eddie stood in his worn nightshirt. Bare feet planted in the snow, his small frame shaking with more than cold. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, reflecting the moonlight like a wild animal's. "Papa, please." Eddie's voice broke with the weight of understanding far beyond his years. "Please don't leave us like Mama did." Behind Eddie, Clara appeared, clutching her rag doll with one arm and reaching for her brother with the other. Her blue eyes, so like Sarah's, stared at her father with a mixture of fear and desperate love that cut deeper than any blade. "Papa, we need you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Even if you're sad, even if you drink the burning water, we still need you." The vial slipped from Cullen's trembling fingers, shattering against Sarah's headstone in a spray of glass and poison. The deadly liquid soaked into the frozen earth as Cullen collapsed forward, his forehead pressed against the cold marble shoulders, shaking with silent sobs that seemed to tear his soul apart. Eddie's small arms wrapped around his father's neck from behind the boy's tears, hot against Cullen's weathered skin. "Don't go away, Papa. Don't go where we can't follow." Clara joined them, her tiny body pressed against his side, her thumb finding its way to her mouth as she struggled with words too big for her to carry. "We love you, Papa, even when you're broken." Cullen gathered his children against him, feeling their heartbeats, their warmth, their absolute faith that somehow their broken father could still hold their world together. The wind howled around them, carrying away the poison and the moment of weakness, leaving only the living and their terrible necessary burden of hope. "I'm sorry," he whispered into Eddie's hair. "I'm so sorry, son." They walked home through the snow in silence. 3 broken pieces of a family that might never be whole again, but refused to shatter completely. Behind them, Sarah's grave stood sentinel in the darkness, and somewhere in the wind, Cullen thought he heard her voice whispering the words she'd spoken on their wedding day. "For better or worse, till death do us part." But death, he was learning, didn't always part what love had joined. Sometimes, it just made the living work harder to honor what remained. The Tate Ranch sprawled across 400 acres of unforgiving Texas wilderness, where summer heat could kill a man, and winter cold could break his spirit. Once the adobe house had been Sarah's pride, whitewashed walls gleaming in the sun, flower boxes beneath every window, and the sound of her voice carrying across the yard as she called the children in for supper. Now the windows stared out, like dead eyes, their glass streaked with dust and neglect. The flower boxes held only withered stems and the brittle remains of last year's hopes. Paint peeled from the walls like old skin, and the front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated sorrows. Cullen stood at the kitchen window, watching Eddie struggle to carry a water bucket nearly as big as himself, while Clara chased the chickens with more desperation than joy. At 32, Cullen looked like a man twice his age, hollow cheeks shadowed by stubble gray, threading through his dark hair, eyes that had once burned with ambition, now dulled by whiskey and grief. The house reflected his neglect like a broken mirror. Dishes piled high in the dry sink dust, gathered thick on furniture Sarah had polished with such care, and the children's clothes hung on their small bodies like scarecrow rags. The pantry grew emptier each day, and the creditors from San Angelo had started making pointed visits about overdue payments. "We can't go on like this," Cullen muttered, reaching for the bottle that had become his constant companion. The whiskey burned down his throat, momentarily warming the cold place where his heart used to be. But even the alcohol couldn't silence the voice in his head, Sarah's voice, full of disappointment at what he'd become. Clara had taken to sleeping in Eddie's room, too frightened of the dark to be alone. Every night, her quiet sobs echoed through the thin walls, a sound that cut through Cullen's drunken stupor like a blade. Eddie, trying so hard to be the man of the house at 8 years old, had developed a cough that worried Cullen when he was sober enough to notice. The boy was too thin, his wrists like bird bones, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Yet he never complained, never asked for help, just kept trying to hold together a world that was falling apart around him. Papa," Eddie said, appearing in the kitchen doorway with his too serious expression. "Mrs. Parker came by again while you were in the barn. She left some biscuits." Cullen turned to see a cloth-wrapped bundle on the table, still warm from Fay Parker's oven. Sarah's best friend had been trying to help for months, but Cullen's pride and shame kept him from accepting her charity. He couldn't bear the pity in her eyes or the unspoken questions about his fitness as a father. "Did you thank her?" Cullen asked, his voice rough from drink and disuse. "Yes, sir. She asked after Clara's cough, and she wanted to know if you needed anything from town. What I need," Cullen thought bitterly, "is my wife back. What I need is to be the man I was before grief broke me in half." Instead, he said, "We're managing fine." But they weren't managing, and everyone knew it. The ranch was dying by degrees, fences, broken cattle, wandering crops, unharvested. The bank in San Angelo had started asking pointed questions about his mortgage payments, and the sheriff had made casual inquiries about the children's welfare. Something had to change, or they'd lose everything Sarah had worked to build. Worse, they'd lose each other to poverty, to the state authorities, to the slow dissolution that came when a family had no center to hold it together. As evening painted the sky blood red, Cullen watched his children settle into their nightly routine. Clara curled up in Eddie's bed, sucking her thumb and clutching the rag doll Sarah had sewn. Eddie lay beside her, one protective arm around his sister, whispering stories to chase away her nightmares. The sight of them nearly broke what was left of Cullen's heart. These children deserved better than a father who could barely function, better than a house that felt more like a tomb than a home. They needed someone who could bring warmth back into their lives, someone who could help them heal from the wound of their mother's loss. But who would want to work for a broken man like him, who would be willing to come to this place where grief hung in the air, like smoke, where every room held memories of the woman who was never coming back? The answer, when it came, would arrive wearing Sarah's face and carrying secrets of its own. But that was still to come, along with choices that would damn them all. San Angelo squatted in the Texas heat, like a wounded animal, its dusty main street baking in the merciless sun. The town had grown around the army fort, drawing the usual collection of merchants, Gamblers, whores, and honest folk trying to scratch out a living on the edge of civilization. It was a hard place for hard people where justice came at the end of a rope, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. Cullen guided his wagon through the rutted thoroughfare, Clara pressed against his side, while Eddie perched on the wagon's edge, his young eyes taking in the controlled chaos of frontier life. Saloon girls laughed too loudly from second-story windows, already drunk though it wasn't yet noon. A group of cowboys, fresh off the trail, threw dice in the shade of Murphy's General Store, their voices carrying crude jokes and cruder promises. The Tate family's appearance drew stares, not the casual curiosity reserved for strangers, but the uncomfortable recognition of neighbors who'd fallen on hard times. Cullen felt the weight of those looks, saw the pity in some faces and the judgment in others. His clothes were clean, but worn patched in places where Sarah's careful needlework showed through. The children's clothes told a similar story of genteel poverty, of a family trying to maintain dignity while the world crumbled around them. "Remember what I told you?" Cullen said, his voice rough from last night's whiskey. "Stay close. Don't talk to strangers." "Yes, sir," Eddie replied, though his eyes continued to track the bustling activity around them. A group of soldiers lounged outside the Red Dog Saloon, their blue uniforms faded and dusty. One of them spat tobacco juice into the street and grinned at Clara, who ducked behind her father's arm. Murphy's General Store smelled of leather tobacco and the sharp tang of pickled goods. The proprietor, a thin man named Murphy, whose Irish accent still colored his words after 20 years in Texas, looked up from his ledger with practiced merchant's smile. "Mr. Tate," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What can I do for you today?" "Need to post a notice," Cullen replied, pulling a crumpled paper from his vest pocket. "Looking for a housekeeper, someone who can cook clean, mind the children." Murphy's eyebrows rose slightly. "I can put this up on the board, but housekeepers are scarce in these parts. Most women got their own families to tend. How much are you offering?" The voice came from behind him, soft but clear, carrying a slight accent that spoke of education and Eastern refinement. Cullen turned and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The young woman standing near the bolt of calico might have been Sarah's ghost, made flesh, the same golden hair catching the afternoon light, streaming through the windows, the same delicate bone structure, the same blue eyes that seemed to hold depths of kindness and carefully hidden sorrow. For a moment, Cullen couldn't breathe. His vision grayed at the edges, and he gripped the counter to keep from swaying. Every detail of the woman's appearance struck him like physical blows, the way she tilted her head when listening, the graceful curve of her neck, even the small scar on her left hand that was so like one Sarah had carried from a childhood accident. And he stammered, then caught himself aware that his staring was drawing curious glances from other customers. $30 a month, plus room and board. The woman's eyes widened. It was generous pay, more than any housekeeper in San Angelo could hope to earn. But there was something else in her expression, a flicker of desperation quickly masked the look of someone weighing options against necessity. "I'm Lydia Blair," she said, extending a gloved hand. Her grip was firm, her palms slightly rough with the calluses of hard work. "I might be interested in the position." Her voice wasn't Sarah's. It carried traces of Virginia, breeding the careful diction of someone educated beyond her current circumstances. But the resemblance was so striking that Clara gasped and pressed closer to her father. "You look like Mama." Clara whispered her first clear words to a stranger in months. Pain flickered across Lydia's features, quickly replaced by a gentle smile. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Clara. And that's Eddie. Our Mama's in heaven with the angels." "I'm sorry for your loss," Lydia said softly, kneeling to Clara's level. There was something in her tone, a recognition of grief, perhaps her own, that made Cullen study her face more closely. Lines of strain around her eyes spoke of recent hardship, and her dress, though clean and carefully mended, had seen better days. "Perhaps we could discuss the details." She continued, rising to face Cullen again. But Cullen was already lost, drowning in memories and desperate hope. This woman, this miraculous resemblance to his Sarah, might be the answer to everything. She could heal his children, bring life back to the ranch, maybe even help him find his way back from the darkness that had claimed him since Sarah's death. "And when can you start?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Lydia hesitated, glancing toward the store's front window as if expecting to see someone. "I need to speak with my father first. He's unwell. I'm his only caregiver. Bring him." Cullen said quickly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "The ranch is big enough. I'll pay extra for his care. Mr. Tate, I don't think you understand. He has consumption. He's dying." The words should have given him pause. Consumption was a death sentence that often claimed whole families. But Cullen was beyond rational thought, caught in the grip of something between hope and obsession. "I don't care," he said more forcefully than he intended. Several customers turned to stare, but he pressed on. "Whatever you need, whatever it takes. My children need someone like you." Lydia studied his face. Seeing the desperation he couldn't hide, the way his hands shook slightly, the haunted look in his eyes that spoke of a man on the edge of complete collapse. There was something almost frightening in his intensity, but there was also genuine pain and the kind of raw grief she recognized from her own mirror. "I live on Elm Street," she said finally. "The small house with the green shutters. Come by tomorrow evening and we'll talk properly." As she left the store, her skirts rustling softly against her legs, Cullen felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope mixed with a darker emotion he didn't want to examine too closely. The way his pulse had quickened when she smiled, the way his eyes had followed the graceful line of her movements, the way he'd imagined what her hair might look like, freed from its pins and spread across a pillow. "Papa," Eddie said quietly, tugging at his father's sleeve. "She really does look like Mama." "Yes," Cullen whispered, watching Lydia disappear into the crowd of afternoon shoppers. His heart was beating faster than it had in months, and for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt truly alive. "She does." But even as hope bloomed in his chest, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. The resemblance was too perfect, too complete. Such things didn't happen by accident in a world where coincidence was often cruelty in disguise. He chose to ignore that voice, as he would ignore many others in the days to come. Some choices once made carry consequences that echo through generations. This was the first of many that would ultimately damn them all. The house on Elm Street crouched at the edge of San Angelo like a wounded animal seeking shelter. What had once been green shutters now hung askew, their paint peeling in long strips that fluttered in the evening breeze like dead skin. The roof was a patchwork of mismatched boards and rusted tin, testament to years of making do with whatever materials could be begged, borrowed, or salvaged. Cullen hesitated at the broken gate, Clara's small hand clenched in his. Eddie pressed close against his other side. The smell of sickness hung in the air, even from outside, that sweet, cloying odor of consumption, mixed with the sharper sense of poverty and desperation. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the crooked chimney, and somewhere inside, a man's coughing fit echoed like gunshots in the growing dusk. "Papa." Clara whispered, her thumb finding its way to her mouth. "It smells sad." Before Cullen could respond, the door opened to reveal Lydia Blair. Her face flushed with embarrassment as she took in their hesitation. She'd changed from her store dress into a simple work skirt and blouse, both carefully patched, but spotlessly clean. Her golden hair was pulled back in a severe bun, as if she were trying to make herself as unremarkable as possible. "Mr. Tate," she said, her voice tight with mortification. "I'm sorry about the state of things. Perhaps we should meet somewhere else." "No." Cullen said firmly, stepping through the gate with more confidence than he felt. I want to understand your situation. The interior of the house struck him like a physical blow. The entire dwelling consisted of a single room barely large enough for a proper bedroom, with a lean-to kitchen tacked onto the back like an afterthought. Yet despite the crushing poverty, every surface gleamed with cleanliness. The rough-hewn table was scrubbed white, the few dishes stacked with military precision, and the single window sparkled despite its cracked pane. A narrow bed occupied one corner, and in it lay the most skeletal human being Cullen had ever seen. Oswald Blair had once been a tall man, that much was evident even in his wasted state. But consumption had carved him down to little more than bones wrapped in yellowed skin. His breathing was a wet, labored wheeze that seemed to echo from the depths of a cave, and his eyes bright with fever, fixed on Cullen with surprising intensity. "Ma papa," Lydia said softly, adjusting the threadbare quilt around her father's skeletal frame. "This is Mr. Tate. He's offered me work." Oswald's gaze swept over Cullen, taking in the quality of his clothes, the health in his face, the way his children stayed close but unafraid. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, each word bought with precious breath. Good work," he wheezed. "Housekeeping," Cullen replied, hat in hand. "Taking care of my children, safe conditions, fair pay." "How much?" The question came from Lydia, practical, despite her obvious discomfort at discussing money in front of strangers. $60 a month. Cullen said, doubling his original offer. It was more money than a housekeeper could hope to see in half a year, but the words were out before he could reconsider. "Plus, room and board, and I'll arrange for a doctor to visit your father twice a week." Lydia's sharp intake of breath was audible. Oswald struggled to sit up his daughter's hands, gentle but firm as she helped him. "Now take it," he gasped, gripping his daughter's wrist with surprising strength. "Take it, Lydia. You can't waste your life watching me die." Papa, no," Lydia said, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I won't leave you, not when you need me most." "I need you to live," Oswald said with a vehemence that triggered another coughing fit. Blood specked his lips as he fought for breath. "I need you to have a future beyond this place." Cullen pulled out a roll of bills, most of his remaining cash money he couldn't really afford to part with. But the sight of Lydia's face, so like Sarah's, yet marked with a strength his wife had never needed to develop, made rational thought impossible. "I'll also arrange for Mrs. Fay Parker to check on your father daily." He continued, "She's a good woman, a friend of my late wife's. She knows about caring for the sick." Lydia stared at the money, then at her father, then at Clara, who was peering around Cullen's legs with frank curiosity. The weight of decision pressed down on her like a physical force. Pride warred with necessity, love with practicality, hope with the bitter knowledge that her father was dying regardless of what she chose. "I need time to think," she said finally. But time, as it turned out, was a luxury the Blair family couldn't afford. That very night, as if summoned by the possibility of separation, Oswald took a violent turn for the worse. His coughing fit was so severe that Lydia feared he might choke on his own blood. She ran through the empty streets of San Angelo to find Dr. Morrison. But the man was deep in his cups at the Red Dog Saloon, belligerent and demanding payment up front before he'd even consider making a house call. Desperate, she pounded on Mrs. Fay Parker's door at midnight, her pride finally crumbling under the weight of her father's need. Fay Parker, a kind-hearted widow in her 50s, who'd known hardship herself, didn't hesitate to help. She pressed coins into Lydia's palm and wrapped a shawl around the younger woman's shoulders. "You look exhausted, child," she said, her worried eyes taking in Lydia's hollow cheeks and the bruised shadows beneath her eyes. "You can't go on like this much longer. That father of yours wouldn't want you to kill yourself caring for him." "He's all I have left," Lydia whispered. "That may be true, but you're all he has too. And what he wants most is to see you safe and settled before he goes." Dr. Morrison, grudgingly sobered by the emergency, managed to ease Oswald's breathing with laudanum and a mixture that tasted like bitter herbs. But his professional assessment was brutally honest. Oswald Blair had weeks at most, possibly days. By morning, the old man was stable, but visibly weaker his skin, taking on the waxy pallor that marked the final stages of consumption. Lydia sat beside his bed, her decision crystallizing with the cold light of dawn. "I'll take the position," she told Cullen when he arrived, with the wagon having spent a sleepless night pacing his empty house. "But I want to visit Papa every Sunday after church." "Of course," Cullen said, relief flooding through him like warm whiskey. "Mrs. Parker will take good care of him." As they loaded Lydia's meager possessions into the wagon, a single trunk, a bag of clothes, and a small crate of books that spoke of better times. She took one last look at the cramped house that had been her world for the past 2 years. Her father managed a weak smile and a whispered, "Be happy, my girl. Be the woman your mother raised you to be." Neither of them knew it would be the last time they'd speak. Neither suspected that within a month both their lives would be forever changed by the dangerous game that had already begun between a broken man's grief and a desperate woman's hope. The wagon pulled away from Elm Street as the sun climbed higher, carrying Lydia Blair toward a future that would test every strength she possessed and reveal weaknesses she never knew she had. Behind them, Oswald Blair watched from his window until they disappeared, then closed his eyes and began the final countdown to whatever lay beyond the veil of mortality. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising the kind of weather that could trap people together in dangerous intimacy. But that was still to come, along with choices that would echo through the generations and leave marks on souls that time could never fully heal. The transformation of the Tate Ranch under Lydia's care was nothing short of miraculous. Within a week, the adobe house emerged from its shroud of neglect like a butterfly from a cocoon. Windows sparkled in the morning sun. Floors gleamed with beeswax and elbow grease, and the scent of fresh bread once again drifted from the kitchen to greet visitors on the front porch. Lydia attacked the work with a fierce determination that spoke of deep personal need, not just for the generous wages Cullen paid, but for the sense of purpose that came from bringing order out of chaos. She rose before dawn to stoke the fire and put coffee on to boil. And she often worked by lamplight long after the children were asleep, mending clothes and preparing lessons for the next day. Clara followed her everywhere, chattering constantly for the first time since her mother's death. The little girl's laughter, long absent from the ranch, began to ring out again as Lydia taught her to braid corn silk dolls and showed her how to coax eggs from nervous hens. Eddie, too, seemed to stand taller with his burdens lightened, though he remained watchful, protective of both his father and their new housekeeper in ways that spoke of hard-earned wisdom. But for Cullen, Lydia's presence was both salvation and exquisite torment. He found himself watching her, constantly studying the way she hummed while she worked, memorizing how her hair caught the morning light, cataloging every gesture and expression. The resemblance to Sarah was uncanny, yet there were differences that fascinated him. Where Sarah had been sheltered and gentle, Lydia bore the marks of hardship with quiet dignity. Where Sarah had been soft-spoken, Lydia's voice carried the strength of someone who'd learned to stand alone against the world. "You're staring again, Papa," Eddie observed one evening as they sat on the front porch watching Lydia hang laundry in the fading light. Cullen startled, heat rising in his cheeks. Is Miss Lydia going to be our new mama?" The question hit like a physical blow, innocent yet devastating in its implications. "No, son," Cullen said, reaching for the whiskey bottle he'd kept close despite his best intentions. "She's our housekeeper. Nothing more." But even as he spoke the words, his traitorous mind wandered to forbidden territory. What would it be like to hold her, to wake beside her, in the cold pre-dawn hours, to see her smile meant just for him, to hear her whisper his name in the darkness? The thoughts made him drink more heavily, seeking to drown the guilt and desire that warred constantly in his chest. It wasn't right to think of another woman so soon after Sarah's death. It wasn't fair to project his desperate needs onto someone who'd come to them seeking honest work, not romantic complications. Yet he couldn't stop himself from imagining what it would be like if Lydia were his wife instead of his employee. If those gentle hands that cared so tenderly for his children might someday touch him with the same devoted attention. 3 weeks into Lydia's employment, the first real test of their arrangement came in the form of Clara's fever. The child woke one morning burning with heat, her small body convulsing with chills that no amount of blankets could ease. With Dr. Morrison unreliable and the nearest hospital a day's hard ride through dangerous country, Lydia took immediate charge. She bathed Clara with cool water, forced bitter medicine down her throat, and sat up all night holding the delirious child when fever dreams made her cry out for her dead mother. Cullen watched from the doorway, his heart breaking at the sight of this woman, who wasn't his wife, caring for his daughter with such selfless devotion. "She's strong," Lydia murmured during one of Clara's quieter moments, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "She'll fight through this." "How do you know?" Cullen asked, stepping into the room despite himself. "Because she has too much love left to give," Lydia replied, smoothing Clara's damp hair back from her forehead. "Children with that much love don't give up easy." When Clara's fever finally broke at dawn, Lydia collapsed in the bedside chair, exhausted but victorious. Cullen found himself standing over her, studying the delicate curve of her neck, the way her lashes cast shadows on her cheeks, the slight parting of her lips as she breathed. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotions he couldn't name. Lydia's eyes opened immediately, alert, despite her exhaustion. For a moment, they looked at each other in silence, and something passed between them, an understanding, an acknowledgement of the dangerous ground they were treading. "She's a beautiful child," Lydia said softly. "She deserves to be loved." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meanings neither dared to voice. Cullen felt himself leaning closer, drawn by forces he couldn't control. But Lydia turned away, breaking the spell before it could fully form. The second test came in the form of rustlers, Mexican bandits, who swept down from the hills like wolves, taking a dozen head of prime cattle in a single night. Cullen rode out with Eddie and 2 hired hands, following the trail toward the border, leaving Lydia alone with Clara for 3 days of uncertainty. They returned, empty-handed, and frustrated, the rustlers having melted back into the Badlands like smoke. But what Cullen found at the ranch stunned him. Not only had Lydia managed every daily chore without missing a beat, she'd also organized the remaining cattle into a more defensible arrangement and convinced the Mexican workers to stay on despite their fear of retribution. "How did you manage all this?" he asked, genuinely amazed. "I grew up on a farm in Virginia," Lydia replied matter-of-factly. "My father raised tobacco before the war ruined everything. I know how to handle livestock and how to deal with men who think a woman can't give orders." There was steel in her voice, a hint of the strength that had carried her through whatever hardships had brought her to Texas. Cullen found himself even more drawn to her, fascinated by the layers of character beneath her quiet exterior. But it was the third test that began to crack the careful foundations of their professional relationship. Word came from town that Oswald Blair had taken another bad turn, and Mrs. Fay Parker sent an urgent message that Lydia should come immediately. Cullen hitched the wagon without question, driving her to San Angelo in tense silence that spoke of growing intimacy neither was ready to acknowledge. They found Oswald unconscious, his breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. Dr. Morrison, sober for once, shook his head grimly after his examination. "It's a matter of hours," he said quietly. "Maybe less." I'm sorry, Miss Blair. Lydia spent that final night holding her father's hand, singing the old songs he'd taught her as a child. Ballads of Virginia mountains and long-lost love that seemed to ease his labored breathing. Cullen waited outside in the wagon, but the thin walls couldn't muffle her voice, and every note cut through him like a blade. When Oswald died just before dawn, drawing one last rattling breath and then falling silent forever, Lydia's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She stumbled out of the house and collapsed against Cullen's chest, her body shaking with grief, so profound it seemed to tear her apart from the inside. For a moment, Cullen forgot everything, except the need to comfort her. His arms tightened around her trembling form, and he pressed his face to her hair, breathing in her scent soap and sorrow and something indefinably feminine that made his heart race despite the circumstances. I'm sorry, she whispered against his chest, her tears soaking through his shirt. I'm so sorry for being weak. You're not weak, he said fiercely, his hands gentle on her back. You're the strongest person I know. You cared for him right to the end. You have nothing to be ashamed of. When she looked up at him, tears streaming down her face and catching the early morning light, something shifted between them. The air grew thick with unspoken desire, and for a heartbeat that lasted an eternity. Cullen thought he might kiss her, might cross that final line between employer and employee, between propriety and passion. Instead, he stepped back, his hands shaking with the effort of restraint. We should get you home, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. As they buried Oswald Blair in the San Angelo Cemetery, a simple service attended by Mrs. Fay Parker and a handful of townspeople who'd known him in better days, Cullen couldn't shake the feeling that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The way Lydia had felt in his arms, the trust she'd shown in her moment of vulnerability, the way she'd looked at him when their eyes met. It was dangerous territory, and he was walking deeper into it with every passing day. That night, he drank more than usual, trying to drown the guilt and desire that warred constantly in his chest. The whiskey helped numb the immediate pain, but it couldn't erase the memory of her body pressed against his or the way his heart had raced when she'd whispered his name. The dangerous game between them had begun in earnest, now fed by grief and loneliness, and the terrible human need for connection. Neither of them recognized the signs of the disaster approaching, or perhaps they simply chose not to see them. Some hungers once awakened become impossible to ignore, and some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed. The storm that would destroy them all was still weeks away, but its seeds had been planted in that moment of shared grief and forbidden comfort. All that remained was for the wind to rise and the rains to come, trapping them together in the intimate darkness, where desire and desperation would finally overwhelm the last barriers of decency and restraint. November descended on the ranch like a predator, bringing with it the kind of bitter cold that could kill the unwary, and winds that howled across the plains like the voices of the damned. The early blizzard struck without warning on the 15th of the month, transforming the Texas landscape into an alien world of drifting snow and ice-sheathed trees. For 3 days, the storm raged with supernatural fury, piling snow against the windows until the house felt like a tomb sealed from the outside world. The wind screamed around the adobe walls with such violence that the children pressed their hands to their ears, and even the cattle huddled together in whatever shelter they could find, their breath forming clouds of steam in the frigid air. On the second night of their imprisonment, Eddie's breathing grew labored. What started as a slight wheeze became increasingly serious as the hours passed, until by midnight the boy was burning with fever and struggling for every breath. His skin took on a grayish pallor that terrified Cullen, bringing back memories of Sarah's final illness with devastating clarity. It's settling in his lungs. Lydia set her experienced hands, checking Eddie's temperature and listening to his chest. 2 years of caring for her consumptive father had taught her to recognize the signs of respiratory distress. We need to keep him warm and get fluids into him. She moved with practiced efficiency, transforming the main parlor into a makeshift sick room closer to the fireplace. All through the night, she worked tirelessly, bathing Eddie's burning skin with cool cloths, forcing spoonfuls of honey-laced tea between his cracked lips, singing soft lullabies that seemed to ease his restless sleep. Clara curled up on the sofa nearby, refusing to leave her brother's side, even when exhaustion made her eyelids heavy. "Is Eddie going to heaven like Mama?" she whispered to Lydia during one of the boys' quieter moments. "No, sweetheart," Lydia replied firmly, though worry shadowed her eyes. "Your brother is strong, and we're going to take good care of him." Cullen tried to help, but his hands shook too badly to be useful. The sight of his son so pale and still brought back the helpless rage he'd felt watching Sarah slip away when all his strength and determination had proved worthless against the inexorable advance of death. Unable to bear the memories, he retreated to the kitchen and sought solace in the whiskey bottle that had become his constant companion. As the night wore on and Eddie's condition seemed to worsen rather than improve, Cullen drank more heavily than he had since the night he'd almost taken his own life. The alcohol burned away his fear and helplessness, replacing them with a dangerous, desperate madness that warped his perception of reality. Near dawn, when the storm's fury had finally begun to abate, Eddie's fever broke. His breathing deepened and steadied color began to return to his cheeks, and he slipped into the peaceful sleep of healing rather than the restless tossing of illness. Lydia, exhausted from her all-night vigil, slumped in the chair beside his makeshift bed, her head tilted back against the cushions, eyes closed in momentary rest. In the dim firelight, with her golden hair loose around her shoulders and her face softened by exhaustion, she looked so much like Sarah that Cullen's alcohol-addled mind simply snapped. Grief, loneliness, and desperate need crashed together in a wave of confusion that swept away the last barriers of reason and restraint. "Sarah," he whispered, stumbling toward her from the kitchen doorway. "Sarah, my darling, you came back to me." Lydia's eyes opened immediately, alert, despite her fatigue. "Cullen, what's wrong? You look—" But he was beyond hearing, lost in a hallucination born of whiskey and devastating loss. In his fevered imagination, his wife had returned to him, had been caring for their son with the same gentle devotion she'd always shown. The months of grief and loneliness collapsed into a single moment of desperate reunion. "I missed you so much." He slurred, reaching for her with hands that shook with more than alcohol. "I couldn't live without you. I almost followed you, but the children needed me." "Cullen, you're drunk," Lydia said, rising quickly from the chair and backing toward the fireplace. "You need to go to bed. Sleep this off." But rationality had fled, replaced by a need so overwhelming it consumed everything else. He caught her arm as she tried to move past him, his grip tighter than he intended, his eyes wild with a madness that transformed his familiar features into something alien and frightening. "Don't leave me again," he pleaded, his voice breaking with anguish. "I can't bear it if you leave me again." "I'm not Sarah," Lydia said firmly, trying to pull away from his grasp. "I'm Lydia, your housekeeper. Please think of the children." Her words were lost as he pulled her roughly against him, his mouth crushing hers with desperate hunger. She struggled, pushing against his chest with both hands, but he was far stronger, and grief had given him a madman's strength. The whiskey on his breath made her gag, and terror began to replace her initial confusion. "Please," she gasped when she managed to break free for a moment. "Please, this isn't right. I'm not her. I could never be her." But Cullen was past hearing, past caring about anything except the need to fill the terrible emptiness that had consumed him for so long. His hands moved to her dress, tearing at the fabric with clumsy desperation, his mind unable to distinguish between memory and reality, between love and possession. "Sarah," he moaned against her neck, his weight forcing her down toward the floor. My Sarah. What followed was swift and brutal, the destruction of trust and innocence in a matter of minutes that would echo through generations. Lydia's screams were muffled by his hand, and then lost entirely in the storm's dying fury. Her struggles grew weaker as shock set in her mind, retreating to some protected place where the horror couldn't reach her. In the doorway leading to the kitchen, awakened by sounds she couldn't understand, 6-year-old Clara stood frozen in terror. She couldn't fully comprehend what she was witnessing, but she knew it was wrong, knew that Miss Lydia was being hurt, that her father's face was twisted with something that had nothing to do with love. The image burned itself into her young memory, a scar that would never fully heal. When it was over, Cullen collapsed beside the dying fire, the madness leaving him as suddenly as it had come. The reality of what he'd done crashed over him like ice water, and he retched violently, his body rejecting the alcohol, and his soul rejecting the monster he'd become. Lydia lay motionless on the floor, her dress torn and her eyes staring at nothing. When she finally moved, it was to pull her shawl around herself with trembling hands and struggle to her feet. Blood trickled from her lip, where his rough kiss had split the skin, and finger-shaped bruises were already forming on her throat. Lydia. Cullen whispered, his voice broken with horror and shame. I thought, God help me, I thought you were. She turned to look at him then, and the expression on her face was something he would carry to his grave, not anger, not hatred, but complete and utter disappointment. The look of someone who had trusted and been betrayed, who had given her best efforts and received violation in return. I know what you thought, she said quietly, her voice dead of all emotion. But I'm not her. I was never her. And now I never can be. She moved toward the door with careful, measured steps, like someone walking on broken glass. Clara shrank back against the wall as she passed her thumb in her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Oh, Miss Lydia, the child whispered, reaching out with one small hand. Lydia paused, kneeling to meet Clara's eyes. For a moment, her mask of control slipped, revealing the devastation beneath. Take care of your brother, she said softly. He's going to be fine now. Then she was gone, slipping out into the dying storm, like a ghost leaving behind only the echo of the closing door and the smell of violence in the overheated air. Cullen remained on the floor beside the fireplace, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he'd once held sacred as honor, his children's trust, his own humanity. The storm had passed, but the real tempest was just beginning. In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, promising more weather to come. But no storm of nature could match the fury that would soon descend upon the Tate ranch, bringing with it a reckoning that would consume everything in its path. Clara crept to her father's side, her small hand touching his shoulder with heartbreaking gentleness. "Papa," she whispered. "Papa, what did you do?" He had no answer for her, no explanation that could possibly suffice. In one moment of drunken madness, he had destroyed everything good in their lives and set in motion events that would damn them all. The only question now was how much more would be lost before the final accounting was complete. Dawn broke gray and pitiless over the ranch, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of ash and despair. Cullen woke from his stupor on the parlor floor, his head pounding with more than just whiskey sickness, his mouth tasting of copper and shame. For one blessed moment, he couldn't remember why he felt so hollow, why his clothes were disheveled, why Clara was pressed against the far wall watching him with eyes full of terror. Then it all came flooding back with the force of a physical blow. "Lydia," he whispered, struggling to his feet on unsteady legs. The parlor showed evidence of the night's violence: overturned chair, scattered cushions, a dark stain on the floor that might have been blood. Lydia. But the house felt empty in a way that went beyond mere absence. Eddie still slept peacefully in his makeshift bed, his fever broken and his breathing steady, but the warmth and life that Lydia had brought to their home had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Clara remained pressed against the wall, her thumb in her mouth, watching her father with the wariness of a wild animal. confronting a predator. She hadn't spoken since witnessing the horror of the night before, and something in her eyes suggested she might never speak freely again. "Where is she?" Cullen asked, his voice cracking with desperation. "Clara, sweetheart, where did Miss Lydia go?" Clara's only response was to shrink further into herself, her silence more damning than any accusation could have been. Cullen stumbled outside into the bitter morning air, his boots crunching through snow that sparkled like broken glass in the weak sunlight. Lydia, please, I need to explain." But his words were swallowed by the vast emptiness of the Texas wilderness. Her tracks led away from the house toward the rocky hills that bordered his property, but the continuing snowfall had already begun to obscure them. He could see where she'd stumbled, where she'd fallen, and picked herself up again, where desperation had driven her forward into terrain that could kill the unwary even in good weather. He saddled his horse with shaking hands and followed the trail as far as he could, calling her name, until his voice went hoarse and his throat felt like raw meat. But the landscape was unforgiving, full of hidden ravines and treacherous slopes, where a person could disappear forever without leaving so much as a scream to mark their passing. As the day wore on and the temperature continued to drop, he was forced to abandon the search or risk leaving his children completely orphaned. The thought of Clara and Eddie waking to find both their housekeeper and their father gone was the only thing that could have driven him back to the ranch house. That evening, consumed by guilt and desperate for some kind of absolution, he hitched the wagon and drove to town through snowdrifts that threatened to swallow the wheels. Mrs. Fay Parker answered her door with surprise, her expression immediately darkening when she saw his haggard appearance and wild eyes. "Cullen, what are you doing out in this weather? Where's Lydia?" The question hit him like a physical blow. In his drunken confusion, his mind had somehow blocked out the memory of Oswald Blair's death, seeking some impossible way to undo what he'd done by returning Lydia to her father's care. "I need to see Oswald," he said, avoiding her penetrating stare. Mrs. Fay's face went white with concern. "Cullen, what's wrong with you? Oswald died 3 weeks ago. You were at the funeral, remember? You helped carry his coffin." The words shattered the last of his desperate delusions. There was no undoing what he'd done, no way to return things to the way they'd been before his moment of madness had destroyed everything. "Where is Lydia?" Mrs. Fay demanded, her voice sharp with growing alarm. She left. We had a disagreement." But Mrs. Fay Parker had known Cullen since he was a boy. Courting Sarah Jenkins had watched him grow from young man to husband to father. She could read the guilt written in every line of his face, could see the shame that made his hands shake and his eyes dart away from direct contact. "What did you do to that girl?" she whispered, her voice filled with horrified understanding. He couldn't answer, couldn't find words for the magnitude of his crime. Instead, he turned and fled, leaving Mrs. Fay standing in her doorway with growing dread and terrible suspicions. The next morning brought no relief from his torment. Eddie was better sitting up and asking for Miss Lydia, with the persistence of a child who doesn't understand why people disappear. Clara remained mute, following her father at a distance, her eyes never leaving him, as if she expected him to transform into a monster again at any moment. By the second day, Mrs. Fay had organized an informal search party. She spread word that Lydia Blair was missing, and while she didn't voice her suspicions about Cullen's involvement directly, her carefully chosen words planted seeds of doubt in the minds of the townspeople. "A young woman doesn't just vanish into a blizzard," she told Jake Morrison at the general store. "Not without something terrible driving her to such desperation." "You think Tate did something to her?" Morrison asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I think that man has been drinking himself into madness since Sarah died." Mrs. Fay replied carefully. "And I think he hired a girl who looked remarkably like his dead wife. A man in that condition? Well, a man in that condition might do things he'd never consider in his right mind." The search parties found nothing but empty wilderness. Lydia had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. But in the saloons and general stores of San Angelo, tongues began to wag with increasing boldness. "Something ain't right about this whole business," muttered Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith, to anyone who would listen. "A woman don't just walk off into a storm for no reason. Especially not a woman working for a man who's been drowning his grief in whiskey for near on a year," added Dr. Morrison's brother Jake. "I seen how Tate looked at that girl. Weren't natural the way his eyes followed her." The gossip grew uglier as the days passed without any sign of Lydia. Some remembered how quickly Cullen had hired her after just one meeting, how generous his offer had been, how he'd insisted she bring her dying father to the ranch. Others noted the resemblance between Lydia and Sarah, speculating about what kind of man would seek to replace his dead wife with a virtual stranger who happened to share her features. Mrs. Fay said nothing openly, but her meaningful silences spoke volumes. She took to visiting the ranch daily, ostensibly to check on the children, but really to study Cullen's face for signs of the guilt she was certain he carried. "You're not sleeping," she observed one gray afternoon, as Clara clung to her skirts, desperate for feminine comfort. "You look terrible." "I'm worried about Lydia," Cullen replied, which was true as far as it went. "We all are," Mrs. Fay said pointedly, her eyes never leaving his face. "The question is, what exactly are we worried about? Are we worried she's lost in the wilderness, or are we worried about what drove her into that wilderness in the first place?" A week passed, then another. The search parties grew smaller and less frequent, but the talk in town grew louder and more pointed. Cullen found himself the target of hostile stares when he came to buy supplies, felt the weight of whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room. Sheriff Briggs, a lazy man who preferred to avoid difficult cases, finally began asking pointed questions about the night Lydia disappeared. He was a political creature who could sense which way the wind was blowing, and the wind in San Angelo was definitely blowing against Cullen Tate. Mighty strange circumstances. Sheriff Briggs mused, leaning against Cullen's wagon outside Murphy's store. Young woman walks out into a blizzard, wearing nothing but a torn dress and a shawl. Makes a man wonder what might have driven her to such desperate measures. She was grieving her father, Cullen said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. Grieving women usually seek comfort. The sheriff replied with a meaningful look. They don't usually run from it. Unless, of course, the comfort being offered ain't the kind a decent woman can accept. The walls were closing in with each passing day. Every conversation carried undertones of suspicion, every glance held accusations that didn't need to be spoken aloud. His children sensed the growing tension. Eddie withdrew into worried silence, while Clara remained locked in her traumatized muteness. The ranch that had once been his sanctuary began to feel like a prison. At night, alone with his guilt and his whiskey, Cullen was haunted by visions of Lydia wandering through the snow, her torn dress offering no protection against the killing cold. In his dreams, he heard her calling his name, sometimes in accusation, sometimes in forgiveness, but always with the voice of the damned. He'd destroyed everything good in his life for one moment of drunken madness, and now the reckoning was approaching like storm clouds on the horizon. Justice, when it came, would be swift and merciless. The only question was whether he would face it as a man or die as the coward his actions had proven him to be. But first, there would be one more revelation to shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew. The truth about Lydia Blair's fate was still to come. And when it arrived, it would bring with it a fury that would consume everything in its path. The riders appeared on the horizon like harbingers of the apocalypse, their horses kicking up dust clouds that darkened the afternoon sky despite the lingering patches of snow. Cullen watched them approach from his front porch, his coffee growing cold in trembling hands as he counted their numbers, 20 men, maybe more, all riding hard toward the ranch with the purposeful intensity of a lynch mob. At their head rode Mrs. Fay Parker, her face set with grim determination and righteous fury. Beside her, Sheriff Briggs sat his horse with obvious reluctance. his hand resting on his gun, more from habit than courage. Behind them came the angry faces of San Angelo Tom Fletcher, the blacksmith Jake Morrison from the general store. Dr. Morrison, despite his usual drunkenness, and a dozen other men whose patience with whispered suspicions had finally run out. Eddie. Cullen called sharply to where his son sat reading on the porch steps. Take Clara upstairs and lock the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear. The boy's eyes went wide with fear as he took in the approaching riders. But Papa, go! The sharpness of Cullen's tone sent both children scurrying, and he heard the bolt slide home on the upstairs door just as the riders thundered into his yard, their horses snorting and stamping in the dust. Mrs. Fay dismounted, first her movements sharp with barely controlled rage. She'd shed her usual maternal gentleness, like a snake shedding skin, revealing the steel beneath that had carried her through her own husband's death and 20 years of frontier hardship. Sakak Cullen Tate. She called out, her voice carrying across the yard with the authority of absolute moral certainty. We need to have words. About what? Cullen asked, though they both knew the pretense was pointless now. About Lydia Blair. Sheriff Briggs said, stepping forward with more backbone than usual. The weight of public opinion had finally given him the courage to do his job. About what you did to that poor girl. I didn't do anything to her. Cullen protested, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Then where is she? Mrs. Fay demanded, her eyes blazing with the kind of righteous fury that had built churches and hanged outlaws throughout the American frontier. A young woman doesn't just disappear into thin air without cause, Cullen. Not without someone giving her cause. The circle of men tightened around the porch, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. These weren't professional lawmen. They were farmers and shopkeepers and working men who'd known Lydia Blair, who'd seen her gentle nature and her devotion to her dying father. They'd come for justice, or what they imagined justice to be. We know what kind of man you've been since Sarah died. Jake Morrison spat, his weathered face twisted with disgust. Drinking yourself senseless, staring at that girl like she was a piece of meat. And her looking so much like your dead wife, it weren't natural. That's not. Cullen began, but his words were cut off by a commotion at the edge of the crowd. A lone rider was approaching at breakneck speed, his horse lathered with sweat and exhaustion. It was Billy Crawford, one of the young men who'd been searching the ravines and canyons east of town. His face was pale with shock, and his hands shook as he reined in his blown horse. Mrs. Parker. He gasped, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard. Sheriff, you need to know we found her. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind sighing through the mesquite trees and the distant cry of a circling hawk. Mrs. Fay's face went white as parchment, and several of the men removed their hats in unconscious respect for the dead. Where? Sheriff Briggs asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bottom of Devil's Canyon. Billy replied, his young voice cracking with emotion. Looks like she fell from the rim during the storm. Her body's, it's all broken up from the rocks. Dress torn to pieces, probably from the fall and the animals that got to her after. A sound rose from the crowd that was part grief, part rage, and part something more primitive than the howl of a community that had found its villain and was ready to exact the price of blood. Men who'd been content to mutter suspicions in saloons were now faced with the cold reality of a young woman's death, and their anger needed a target. Billy's horse danced nervously as the rider continued his terrible report. Doc Morrison's with the body now, but he says she's been dead since the night she disappeared. Had to be. Nobody could survive in Devil's Canyon in that kind of weather, especially not. He swallowed hard. Especially not dressed like she was. You killed her. Tom Fletcher roared, pointing an accusing finger at Cullen. You had your way with that poor girl, and then threw her off that cliff to hide your shame. Cullen protested. but his voice was lost in the mob's growing fury. "Look at his face," Jake Morrison yelled to the crowd. "Look at his eyes. He's guilty as sin." And indeed, Cullen's expression betrayed him completely. The guilt, the shame, the knowledge of what he'd done it was all written there for everyone to see. Not the guilt of murder, perhaps, but the guilt of something almost as terrible. The guilt of a man who destroyed an innocent woman's life through his own weakness and perversion. "String him up," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "He ain't fit to live," added another voice, and the cry was taken up by others until it became a chant that rose above the Texas wind like a prayer to an angry God. Sheriff Briggs raised his hands, trying to restore some semblance of order, but the mob's blood was up now. They'd found their villain, and they wanted their pound of flesh. Rope appeared in several hands, and talk turned to finding a suitable tree with branches strong enough to bear a man's weight. "Now hold on," the sheriff called out. But his voice lacked conviction. He was a political creature, and he could read the mood of his constituents as clearly as anyone. "We need to follow proper procedures." "Procedures." Mrs. Fay's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. What procedures did he follow when he attacked that girl? What law was he thinking of when he drove her out into a blizzard to die? Cullen backed toward his front door, one hand reaching for the rifle he kept beside the frame. "Stay back," he warned, his voice cracking with desperation. "I've got children in this house. Children you ain't fit to raise." Mrs. Fay snapped back. "Poor things having to live with the man who murdered their housekeeper? I didn't murder her." Cullen shouted the words torn from his throat by desperation and guilt. "I never meant for her to die. I was drunk, I was grieving, I thought she was—" The partial confession hung in the air like smoke, damning him more completely than any evidence could have done. The crowd surged forward as one no longer interested in talk or procedure, only in the swift justice that came at the end of a rope. That was when Clara's voice cut through the chaos like a knife through flesh, high and clear and desperate, calling down from the upstairs window where her pale face appeared like a ghost against the glass. "Papa didn't kill Miss Lydia." She cried, her child's voice somehow carrying over the mob's fury. "She ran away because Papa hurt her real bad, but he didn't push her off no cliff." Every head turned to stare up at the window, where Clara's face appeared, her eyes wide with the terrible burden of truth. The 6-year-old's words carried the simple honesty that only children possess, cutting through the adult's assumptions and accusations with devastating clarity. "What did you see, child?" Mrs. Fay called up, her voice gentling despite her rage. "Tell us what happened." Clara's thumb went to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears as she remembered that terrible night. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of absolute truth. "Papa was drinking the burning water and crying about Mama being gone," she said, her child's voice somehow making the horror more terrible in its innocence. "Miss Lydia was taking care of Eddie because he was sick with a fever. Papa grabbed her and pushed her down and hurt her real bad. She was crying and her dress got all torn up." The silence that followed was deafening. Every man in that crowd understood what the child was describing, and the knowledge of it made them sick with a rage that went beyond simple anger into something approaching religious fury. "Then what happened, sweetheart?" Mrs. Fay asked, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. Miss Lydia got up and put her shawl on and went outside in the storm. Clara continued, her words coming faster now, as if she needed to get them all out before she lost her courage. "Papa was lying on the floor, making sick noises. I wanted to help Miss Lydia, but I was scared of Papa. I was scared he might hurt me too." The crowd turned as one to stare at Cullen, and what they saw in his face confirmed every word of his daughter's testimony. He wasn't a murderer in the technical sense. He hadn't pushed Lydia Blair off Devil's Canyon. But he was something worse, a man who had violated trust and innocence, who had destroyed a woman so completely that death in the wilderness had seemed preferable to remaining in his presence. Ackersalt, Cullen Tate. Sheriff Briggs said, his voice heavy with disgust and something approaching sorrow. "You're under arrest for the criminal assault of Lydia Blair. And for her death," Tom Fletcher added harshly. "She wouldn't have run into that storm if you hadn't done what you did. Her blood is on your hands just as sure as if you'd pushed her yourself." Cullen let the rifle fall from his nerveless fingers. There was no point in fighting anymore. His daughter had spoken the truth, and the truth was damning enough. He'd destroyed Lydia Blair as surely as if he'd thrown her from the canyon rim himself, had violated her so completely that freezing to death alone in the wilderness had seemed like mercy. As the men bound his hands with rope and prepared to load him into a wagon for the journey to San Angelo's jail, Cullen looked up one last time at his children's faces in the upstairs window. Eddie held Clara close, both of them crying, both of them staring down at their father as if he were a stranger, which perhaps he was. The man who'd loved Sarah, who'd built this ranch with his own hands, who'd dreamed of giving his children a good life, that man had died at the night he'd betrayed everything he'd ever believed in. What remained was just a hollow shell, a creature of appetite and weakness, who'd let grief and alcohol transform him into the very thing he'd always despised. The wagon pulled away from the ranch as the sun began to set, carrying Cullen toward whatever justice awaited him in town. Behind him, the adobe house stood empty, except for two traumatized children and the ghost of the woman who died because of one man's inability to distinguish between love and possession, between memory and reality. The reckoning had come at last, but it would not end with Cullen's arrest. The echoes of that terrible night would reverberate through the years, shaping lives and destinies in ways none of them could imagine. Some sins are too great to be washed away by justice alone, and some wounds cut too deep to ever fully heal. The storm had passed, but its damage would endure for generations to come. The jail cell in San Angelo was a cage barely fit for animals. Iron bars, black with rust, a thin straw mattress crawling with vermin, and a bucket in the corner that reeked of the desperate needs of desperate men. Cullen sat on the narrow cot with his head in his hands, listening to the sound of his own breathing and the constant murmur of voices from the street outside. The townspeople gathered daily beneath his barred window, and their conversations always returning to the same dark themes. Lydia Blair's broken body at the bottom of Devil's Canyon, the terrible violation that had driven her to seek death in the wilderness, and the man who'd caused it all. Some called for a quick hanging. Others demanded he be turned over to the Apaches for the kind of justice that would make death seem like mercy. Sheriff Briggs had tried to build a case for murder, but the evidence wouldn't support it. What remained of Lydia's body showed injuries consistent with a long fall onto sharp rocks, broken bones, torn flesh damage from the scavengers that had found her before Billy Crawford's search party. There were no signs of violence that couldn't be explained by her desperate flight through treacherous terrain in the middle of a blizzard. But the assault was undeniable, confirmed by his own daughter's devastating testimony. Clara's innocent words had painted a picture more damning than any physical evidence could have provided: a grown man using his strength to violate a woman who'd trusted him, who'd cared for his children, and brought warmth back to his cold house. Dr. Morrison, shaken into sobriety by the gravity of the situation, had examined Lydia's remains with unusual care. His findings, delivered to a packed courtroom 3 weeks after Cullen's arrest, left no doubt about what had happened that night. The deceased shows evidence of recent trauma consistent with sexual assault. He testified, his usually slurred words precise and clinical. Bruising on the throat and wrists, torn clothing, other injuries I won't detail in mixed company. She also visited my office the night before her disappearance, seeking treatment for what she claimed were injuries from a fall. I was indisposed at the time, but I remember her condition clearly now. The doctor's testimony hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt, confirming what everyone had suspected, but few had dared to voice openly. A woman had been violated by the man she'd trusted to protect her, had been driven into the wilderness by shame and terror, and had died alone in the cold because death seemed preferable to remaining in her attacker's presence. For 3 weeks, Cullen remained in his cell, while the town debated his fate. The circuit judge, a stern man named Harrison, who'd ridden down from Austin, insisted on following proper legal procedures despite the mob's demand for immediate justice. The assault charge would likely mean 5 to 10 years in the state prison if Cullen lived long enough to serve them. The threats came daily passed through the bars by visitors who claimed to be conducting other business. Notes promising violent retribution appeared under his cell door each morning. Voices in the night called for his blood, and more than once Sheriff Briggs had to disperse crowds that gathered outside the jail with ropes and torches. Mrs. Fay Parker visited exactly once, bringing news that cut deeper than any physical wound. "The children are staying with me," she said, her voice cold as winter steel. "Clara's still not talking much, and Eddie keeps asking if you're really his father. Says fathers are supposed to protect people, not hurt them. How are they managing?" Cullen asked, though he dreaded the answer. As well as can be expected for children whose father destroyed the one person who'd brought joy back into their lives. She replied with brutal honesty. "Clara won't sleep alone anymore. She has nightmares about you turning into a monster. Eddie tries to take care of her, but he's just a boy. A boy who's seen too much and lost too much because of your weakness." The words cut deeper than any blade. "They're better off without me," Cullen whispered. "Maybe so." Mrs. Fay agreed, her honesty merciless, but not entirely unkind. But they don't understand that yet. All they know is that their world has fallen apart again, and this time it was their own father who destroyed it. When the circuit judge finally convened court in December, the proceedings were swift and merciless. Cullen was brought before Judge Harrison, in shackles facing a courtroom packed with hostile townspeople whose anger had only grown stronger during the weeks of waiting. The winter air outside was bitter, but the atmosphere inside the courthouse was even colder. Clara's testimony was read aloud by the court clerk, each word falling like stones into still water, creating ripples of disgust and fury throughout the room. Her child's voice, captured in careful transcription, somehow made the horror more terrible in its innocent honesty. Dr. Morrison testified about Lydia's injuries and her final visit to his office. Mrs. Fay spoke of the young woman's character, her devotion to her dying father, her gentleness with the Tate children. Billy Crawford described finding her body broken and discarded at the bottom of Devil's Canyon like something less than human. Through it all, Cullen sat in silence, his head bowed, offering no defense because none existed. What could he say? That he'd been drunk? That grief had driven him to madness? That in his alcohol-fueled delusion, he'd mistaken her for his dead wife? None of it excused what he'd done. None of it would bring Lydia back or heal the trauma he'd inflicted on his own children. "How do you plead?" Judge Harrison asked when the evidence had been presented. Cullen rose unsteadily to his feet, his voice barely audible when he spoke. "Guilty, Your Honor. I'm guilty of everything you've heard here today." The admission sent a murmur through the packed courtroom. Judge Harrison, a man who'd seen every variety of human depravity during his years on the bench, studied Cullen with cold gray eyes. "The court sentences you to 10 years hard labor at the state penitentiary." He pronounced, his gavel falling like the sound of a coffin lid closing. "And you should count yourself fortunate, Mr. Tate. The evidence presented here would justify a hanging, and frankly, that might be more merciful than what awaits you in prison." That night, as Cullen prepared for transport to the state prison in Huntsville, a miracle occurred, or perhaps it was divine intervention. Mechanical failure or sabotage by someone who wanted him to face frontier justice rather than legal proceedings. The lock on his cell door weakened by years of use, and the sheriff's negligence finally gave way with a soft click that seemed loud as thunder in the midnight silence. He could have run. Should have run. Mexico was only 2 days hard riding to the south, and there were places in California where a man could lose himself completely. But where would he go? His children needed closure, and so did the town. So did the ghost of Lydia Blair, whose death would haunt him until his own final breath. Instead of fleeing, Cullen walked out of the jail and disappeared into the darkness, not to escape justice, but to find his own way of facing it. For 3 days, the Tate Ranch stood empty, while Sheriff Briggs organized half-hearted search parties, and the townspeople assumed their quarry had fled to Mexico like a coward. Mrs. Fay Parker made arrangements to formally adopt Eddie and Clara, giving them the stable home they desperately needed after losing their mother to childbirth and their father to his own monstrous appetites. On the morning of the 4th day, smoke was spotted rising from the ranch house chimney. Mrs. Fay arrived with Sheriff Briggs and several armed men, expecting to find Cullen barricaded inside, perhaps making some desperate final stand. Instead, they found the front door standing wide open and the house transformed beyond recognition. Every surface gleamed with fresh cleaning. The floors shone with beeswax, the windows sparkled like crystal, and fresh bread cooled on the kitchen counter, filling the air with the scent of better times. Laundry hung on the line, snapping crisp and white in the December breeze. The parlor where the assault had taken place showed no trace of that terrible night, and the bloodstains were gone. The furniture arranged just as Sarah had preferred it, even the cushions plumped and positioned with care. They found Cullen in Sarah's favorite chair in the main room, dressed in his best suit, the same one he'd worn to marry her 15 years before. On the table beside him sat 2 items, a brown bottle that had once contained laudanum, now 3/4 empty, and a thick envelope sealed with wax and addressed in his careful handwriting, "For my children when they are old enough to understand." He was still breathing when they found him, but barely. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor of approaching death, and his eyes, once clouded with guilt and whiskey, were clear and peaceful for the first time in months. "The letter," he whispered to Mrs. Fay as she knelt beside him, her anger temporarily forgotten in the face of imminent death. "Make sure they read it. Make sure they know I'm sorry." Sheriff Briggs picked up the envelope, heavy with several sheets of paper. "What does it say?" "Everything." Cullen replied, his voice growing fainter with each word. "The truth about what I did. Why I did it. How sorry I am. How much I loved their mother. How much I failed them all." Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour, but there was nothing to be done. The laudanum had done its work too well, shutting down Cullen's organs one by one in a process that was irreversible. He died as the sun set over the ranch he'd built with his own hands, the ranch where he'd loved and lost and committed the sin that had destroyed his soul. The townspeople had expected to feel satisfaction at his death, justice served even if by his own hand rather than the hangman's noose. Instead, they found themselves strangely hollow. Lydia Blair was still dead. The children were still orphaned. The community was still fractured by violence that had torn through their midst like a tornado, leaving destruction in its wake. But there was something else too, a sense that Cullen Tate had faced his crime in the only way his conscience would allow, had chosen his own punishment when the law's justice seemed insufficient. The house spoke of his final days of a man, trying to restore what he destroyed, trying to leave something clean and whole for the children he could never face again. Mrs. Fay Parker kept Cullen's letters sealed for 7 long years, until Eddie turned 15 and Clara 13. On a quiet Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1882, she gathered them in her parlor and handed over their father's final words. The letter ran to 15 pages, written in Cullen's careful script during the long nights after his escape from jail. It began with an apology that could never be sufficient, and ended with a plea for forgiveness that might never come. Between those bookends lay the full story: his love for their mother, his descent into grief and alcohol after her death, his inexcusable crime against Lydia Blair, and the way that single moment of weakness had destroyed everything he'd ever valued. "I hired Miss Lydia because she reminded me of your mother," he had written. I thought she could fill the emptiness in our home, in my heart. But I was wrong to put that burden on her, wrong to see her as a replacement for something that could never be replaced. Your mother was unique, irreplaceable, and my desperate need to find her again in someone else was the beginning of my downfall. The letter went on to describe his final days in detail, how he'd used the time after his escape to restore the ranch house to the conditions Sarah would have wanted, how he'd spent hours at her grave begging forgiveness, how he'd left flowers on Lydia's simple marker in the town cemetery every day until his death. I know you may never forgive me. The letter concluded, and I don't deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that the love I had for you and your mother was real, even if I proved unworthy of it. Don't let my failures poison your memories of the good times we shared as a family. Don't let my weakness make you believe that all men are capable of such things. Be better than I was. Be the people your mother would have wanted you to become. Eddie, now a young man with his father's strong jaw, but his mother's gentle eyes, folded the letter carefully when he finished reading. Clara, who had grown into a quiet, thoughtful girl, wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Do you forgive him?" Mrs. Fay asked gently. Eddie was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the Texas landscape that had shaped them all. "I don't know," he said finally. "Maybe someday, but not today. Not yet." Clara nodded her agreement. "He was our papa, and part of me will always love him for the good times before Mama died and before what happened. But he did something terrible to Miss Lydia. She trusted him, and he broke that trust in the worst possible way. Both things can be true at the same time." The Tate Ranch sold the following spring to a family from Kansas who had no knowledge of its tragic history. The new owners tore down the old adobe house and built a larger, more modern structure, erasing the last physical traces of the family that had lived and loved and suffered there. But in the San Angelo Cemetery, 3 graves remained as silent witnesses to the tragic story that had unfolded Sarah Elizabeth Tate, beloved wife and mother. Lydia Blair, aged 23, who died far from her home in Virginia. And Cullen Tate, whose simple headstone bore only his name and dates with no loving epitaph to soften the harsh truth of his legacy. Eddie Tate became a teacher and eventually a school principal in Austin, dedicating his life to educating children and serving his community with the quiet dignity his mother had always shown. He married a kind woman named Ruth, and they raised 4 children who grew up knowing their grandfather's story only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked grief and the importance of seeking help when darkness threatens to overwhelm the soul. Clara Tate never married, choosing instead to become a nurse who worked in hospitals from Texas to California. Her gentle hands and compassionate heart helped heal wounds both visible and hidden, and those who worked with her often remarked on her unusual ability to comfort patients who'd suffered trauma. She never spoke publicly about what had shaped her calling, but those closest to her suspected she was trying to balance scales to bring healing where her father had brought harm. Mrs. Fay Parker lived to be 89, serving as surrogate mother to the Tate children and grandmother to their own families. She never married again, claiming that one good man had been enough for any woman's lifetime. On her deathbed in 1899, she made one final trip to the cemetery, leaving white wildflowers on all 3 graves and whispering a prayer for peace that had been too long in coming. The story of Cullen Tate and Lydia Blair became part of local folklore, told and retold, until the truth became legend and the legend became myth. Different versions emerged over the years. Some painted Cullen as a monster, others as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. But for those who had lived through it, who had known the real people behind the tragic tale, it remained what it had always been. A stark reminder that even good people are capable of terrible things when grief and desperation overwhelm their better angels. In the end, justice was served not by the hangman's rope or the prison walls, but by the slow, inevitable weight of consequence and conscience. Cullen Tate had destroyed everything he'd ever loved in a single moment of madness, and he'd spent his final days learning that some sins can only be atoned for through the complete surrender of everything that makes life worth living. The graves in the San Angelo Cemetery stand today weathered by more than a century of Texas wind and rain. Visitors sometimes pause to read the simple inscriptions, wondering about the lives behind the names, the stories that ended in this quiet place beneath the endless sky. There are no easy answers carved in stone, no comfortable moral certainties to take away. Only the hard truth that our choices define us, that the price of those choices can echo through generations, and that some wounds, no matter how much time passes, never fully heal. But perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the memory of Lydia Blair and the tragedy that claimed her serves its purpose simply by existing, by reminding each new generation that the capacity for both good and evil lives in every human heart, and that the difference between the two often comes down to nothing more than a single choice made in a moment of weakness or strength. The wind still blows across the Texas plains, carrying with it the whispers of those long dead, the echoes of love and loss, and the terrible price of allowing grief to transform into something darker. And in that wind, if you listen carefully, you might still hear the voice of a young woman who died too soon and too far from home, reminding us all that trust, once broken, can never be fully restored, but that perhaps in the remembering, we might learn to be better than those who came before.